Smell of cinnamon rolls always takes me back to that Christmas morning. I had woken up at 5, the way I always do, my body refusing to sleep in even when I desperately wanted it to. The kitchen was still dark. I turned on just the small light above the stove, the one my late husband Frank had installed in 1987 because he said overhead lighting at dawn was an act of violence, and I started mixing the dough. That was my tradition. 32 years of Christmas mornings, same recipe, same chipped ceramic bowl with the blue flowers on the rim. My son had moved back in 8 months before that. Him and his wife, Claudia, and their dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who had claimed my good sofa within the first 48 hours. I want to be honest with you, I was happy when they asked. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, the most important thing he is, had hit a rough patch at work. A tech layup, they call it now, like softening the word makes it hurt less. He lost his position at a software company in March, and Claudia had been freelancing, doing something with social media that I never fully understood. They couldn't keep up with their apartment rent in the city. I had 4 bedrooms and a paid-off house in suburban Ohio that Frank and I had worked our entire lives to own outright. It seemed simple. It seemed like the obvious thing a mother does. "Just until we get back on our feet, Mom," my son had said on the phone. His voice sounded tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager and too proud to cry. "You don't even have to ask," I told him. And I meant it. Claudia was polite in those first weeks. She helped clear the dinner table without being asked. She said, "Please and thank you." She complimented my cooking, which I know now was strategic because a woman who would later tell me my pot roast was a little heavy for modern tastes was not a woman who genuinely loved my cooking. The changes were gradual. That's the thing nobody warns you about. It isn't a single moment you can point to. It's a slow accumulation, like water damage behind a wall, invisible until one day the whole structure is compromised. It started with the bathroom. Claudia preferred the main bathroom on the second floor, which happened to be the one attached to the master bedroom, my bedroom. She asked very sweetly if I would mind using the guest bathroom downstairs just in the mornings because she had a standing video call at 9 and needed the better lighting. I said, of course, honey, no problem at all. Then the kitchen. She had a system. I didn't know about the system until I violated it. I put a pot in the wrong cabinet and she explained, calmly but with that particular patience people reserve for the very young or the very old, that she had reorganized the kitchen for better workflow. I stood in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I had canned peaches every August for 20 years, where I had taught my son to make scrambled eggs, where Frank and I had slow danced once to a song on the radio at 2 in the morning after a dinner party. And I nodded like a guest. I told myself it was temporary. 8 months in, I was still telling myself it was temporary. That Christmas morning, I was halfway through the cinnamon roll dough when Claudia came downstairs. It wasn't even 7 yet. She was in a silk robe I suspected cost more than my monthly electric bill, holding her phone like it was an extension of her body. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Oh," she said. She had a way of saying, "Oh," that wasn't really a word so much as a judgment. "You're already in here." "Merry Christmas," I said. She looked at the flour on the counter, the bowl, the butter I'd left out to soften. "I was going to make a frittata," she said. I told Weston we'd have something special this morning. Weston, my son. She had started calling him Weston sometime around October, though he'd been Wes his entire life, and I had named him Wesley after Frank's father. "There's plenty of room," I said. "I'll be out of your way in an hour. The rolls just need to proof." She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite refusal and went to the refrigerator. I kept working. I told myself this was fine. I had made cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning since before she was born. My son came down around 8. He kissed my cheek, which he'd always done, and looked genuinely happy to see the rolls rising. "Mom, you made them. I've been thinking about these since October." Claudia handed him a coffee and said, I was going to do something a little more elegant this year, but she smiled and shrugged, and that small but sat in the room like something spilled that nobody wanted to clean up. I kept smiling. I was very good at smiling by then. The real moment. The moment I think about when I'm trying to identify where I finally found the bottom came 3 days after Christmas. I had plans. This is important because Claudia later acted as though the plans themselves were the problem, as if me having a life was the offense. My college friend Harriet was in town visiting her daughter, and we had made a lunch reservation at a restaurant downtown. Harriet and I had known each other since 1977. We had been in each other's weddings. She had held my hand at Frank's funeral. I had driven 6 hours to be with her when her husband had his first heart attack. This was not some casual acquaintance. This was the architecture of my adult life. I was dressed and ready by 11. I was wearing the blue wrap dress I'd bought myself for my birthday, and I had done my hair properly for the first time in weeks because I wanted to feel like myself again, just for an afternoon. Claudia was on the couch with her laptop. My son was in the spare room he converted into a home office, on a call. She looked up when I came into the living room and did a slow assessment of my outfit, the way a person might appraise a piece of furniture they were considering returning. "You're going somewhere," she said. It wasn't a question. Lunch with Harriet. I mentioned it on Tuesday. "Right." She closed her laptop halfway. "Listen, I've been meaning to talk to you. The house is a disaster. There are dishes in the sink, the bathrooms need cleaning, and Biscuit has tracked mud everywhere. I have a deadline today and Weston's on calls until 4. I really need you to cancel your plans and take care of the house." I stood very still. "I want you to understand something. I have never in my life been a woman who lacked a backbone. I raised my son essentially alone after Frank got sick. I managed our finances, our medical decisions, our grief. I taught high school English for 29 years, and if you've ever managed a classroom of 16-year-olds who do not want to read Shakespeare, you understand that passivity is not a survival trait. Whatever Claudia had decided I was not that, but I had been trying to keep the peace, for my son's sake, for the dream of a household that wasn't fractured. I had been making myself smaller for 8 months, and I had convinced myself it was generosity. "Claudia," I said, and I was proud of how even my voice was. "This is my home. Those are not my dishes in the sink. The mud is from your dog, and I have plans I've had for 3 weeks." She blinked. I don't think anyone had spoken to her that directly in some time. "I'm just asking for a little help," she said, her voice shifting into something softer, injured. "We all live here." "We do," I agreed. "And when I made messes, I cleaned them. I would appreciate it if you'd do the same." She stood up. That was when things changed. Something in her expression went from calculated to simply angry, and she stopped performing. "Do you know what your son does for this family?" she said. "Do you know how hard he works? The least you can do. You're retired, you're here all day. The least you can do is contribute. You live here rent-free. You should be grateful." "Rent-free, in my own house. That I own? That Frank and I paid a mortgage on for 30 years. "I'd like you to lower your voice," I said. She didn't. She raised it. And she said things I won't repeat in full, but the word useless featured prominently, and so did the suggestion that I didn't understand how the modern world worked. And at some point, my son appeared in the hallway with his phone still in his hand, having heard the last part of it. And he looked between us with an expression I recognized as the one he had perfected as a child when he wanted to avoid choosing sides. "Okay, let's just calm down," he started. I picked up my purse from the entry table. I put on my coat. My hands were steady. I was surprised by how steady they were. "I'm going to lunch," I said. "We'll talk when I get back." Claudia said something as I walked out. I didn't catch all of it. I heard "unbelievable," and I heard "her house" said in a tone that made the word sound like a joke. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 2 minutes before I started the engine. I needed those 2 minutes. I won't pretend I didn't. Harriet knew immediately that something was wrong. She's known me for 47 years, and she can read me the way I read weather. We ordered our food, and she waited until the bread arrived, and then she said, "Tell me." So I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, you know this can't continue." Dorothy. That's my name. I should have told you from the beginning, but it took me a moment to figure out how to start this story, and I started in the wrong place. My name is Dorothy Ann Calloway. I'm 68 years old. I was a high school English teacher for 29 years, a wife for 31, a mother for 43, and a widow for 4. I own my home outright, and I have a retirement that I worked for, and until 8 months ago I had considered myself a sensible woman. I know, I said, but he's my son. He stood in that hallway, Harriet said, and did nothing. That was what kept me up that night. Not Claudia. I had stopped expecting anything from Claudia. It was my son. Standing there with his phone in his hand and that look on his face. He had called me that evening after I came home to a house that was pointedly silent, and he had said he was sorry she'd gotten so upset, and that things were stressful, and that he hoped I understood. He had not said she was wrong. He had not said she was wrong. He had not said what happened was unacceptable. He had managed the situation the way he'd managed it for 8 months, which is to say he had managed my feelings and left everything else untouched. I need to understand what's actually happening here, I told Harriet. Financially, legally, all of it. She nodded slowly. You need to talk to someone who knows. My neighbor across the street, a woman named Barbara, who I'd known for 20 years, had a son-in-law who practiced family and property law. She'd mentioned him once or twice in passing. The following Monday, I called her and asked if she thought he'd be willing to speak with me. She said she'd ask. 2 days later, I was sitting in a quiet, wood-paneled office downtown across from a man named Warren, late 40s, reading glasses, the kind of calm, professional manner that makes you feel immediately that you're in capable hands. I told him the situation. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Not dramatic questions, practical ones. Was the house in my name only? Yes. Had I ever added anyone to the deed or any financial accounts? No. Had I co-signed anything? I didn't think so. Had I given anyone power of attorney? Absolutely not. He folded his hands and said, You're in a stronger position than you may realize. Legally, as the sole owner of the property, you have the right to determine who lives there and under what terms. The question is whether you've established any informal agreements, verbal or implied, that could complicate things. I said they could stay until they got back on their feet, I said. No lease, no timeline, nothing in writing. That's common in family situations. The law in Ohio would still treat this as a licensee arrangement, not a tenant arrangement, given the lack of a formal rental agreement and the family context. That means the standard eviction protections don't necessarily apply in the same way, but I'd want to look more carefully at the specifics before you make any moves. Then he said, There's something else I think you should be aware of. He asked if I had ever shared banking passwords or account access with anyone in the household. I told him no. He asked if I had noticed any unusual activity in my financial accounts. I told him I hadn't looked closely, to be honest. I'd been trusting. He suggested I look. I went home that afternoon and I sat down at my computer and I pulled up my accounts. All of them. The checking account, the savings account, the investment account Frank and I had built over 20 years. It took me about 20 minutes to find the first one. There was a subscription service charge I didn't recognize. Then another. Small amounts, the kind you don't notice unless you're looking. $14, $22, a recurring charge of $67 for something labeled a streaming bundle that I had never signed up for. I scrolled back further. Some of them went back 5 months. Then I found the larger one. In September, there was a transfer of $800 from my savings account to an account I didn't recognize, labeled with a reference number that meant nothing to me. I sat very still for a long time looking at that number. I called Warren the next morning. He told me to come in and bring my bank statements. He also recommended I call my bank's fraud department immediately, which I did from the parking lot of his office building while my hands, for the first time in this whole ordeal, were not quite steady. The bank investigator I spoke with was a young woman named, well, I don't want to use her name, but she was thorough and professional, and she walked me through it without making me feel foolish for not having caught it sooner. What she found was that someone had used my account credentials, somehow obtained, to set up a linked external account. The transfers had been small and irregular enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts. I want to be careful here about what I say because it became a legal matter, and some of it I'm still not at liberty to fully discuss. But I can tell you this, the pattern of transfers corresponded to a time period that matched, almost exactly, when Claudia had begun spending extended periods alone in the house while my son was at the library or running errands. I can also tell you that among Claudia's things, which I had every legal right to be aware of given they were stored in my home, There were credit card statements showing purchases at levels that made no sense for someone with no steady income. Designer items, expensive cosmetics, restaurant charges from places I'd seen her mention to friends. Warren filed the appropriate reports. The bank's fraud department filed their own. I was advised by Warren not to confront anyone directly until the investigation had run its course, which was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. I sat across from my son at dinner and passed in the green beans and asked about his job search and listened to Claudia talk about a podcast she was enjoying, and I kept my face perfectly neutral. I had always been good at neutral. 29 years of classroom poker face. 3 weeks after I first walked into Warren's office, I sat my son down, just the two of us, in the living room, on a Sunday afternoon while Claudia had taken Biscuit for a walk. I told him that I had discovered unauthorized access to my accounts. I told him that the bank was investigating. I told him what had been found. The color drained out of his face in a way I've only seen happen to a person a few times in my life, and one of them was at Frank's diagnosis. "Mom," he said, "I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't know." I looked at him for a long moment. "He's my son. I know his face better than I know my own." I believed him. "Then you need to decide what you do next," I said, "because that investigation is going to reach its conclusion whether or not you do anything, and I need to know where you stand." He stood in the right place. He confronted Claudia when she got back from the walk. I was upstairs. I heard portions of it. Not deliberately, but the house isn't large and voices carry. I heard Claudia first deny everything and then admit that she had borrowed money she'd intended to repay, and then cycle through every defensive posture available, including that I had never made her feel welcome and that she was under tremendous stress and that she hadn't thought it was really hurting anyone. My son asked her to leave. She cried. She did. I want to be fair about that. She sat on the stairs and she cried. And I came downstairs because I could hear it and something in me couldn't just stay put. I'm a mother. I'm not made of stone. She looked up at me from the stairs and she said, "I know you hate me." "I don't hate you," I said, because it was true. Hate is exhausting and I've never had the energy for it. I think you made choices that hurt people. I think you need to reckon with that. She moved out over the course of 2 days. My son helped her. It was awful and quiet and nobody said much. The dog went with her, which honestly was the only thing in that departure that cost me any real emotion because whatever Claudia was, Biscuit had been genuinely sweet. The investigation concluded. There was a civil recovery process that I won't walk through in detail. I got most of it back. Not all. The legal process is slow and imperfect, and if anyone tells you justice is swift and total, they are being optimistic. My son stayed for another 6 weeks. We had long conversations we probably needed to have for years about how he'd handled things, about what he'd allowed to go on, about what I had needed him to do and he hadn't done. Some of those conversations were hard. There was one night when he cried in a way I hadn't seen since he was 11 years old, and I sat with him the same way I had then. I kept thinking if I just didn't make it a bigger deal, he said, it would smooth out on its own. I know, I said. But you can't smooth your way through everything. Some things you have to actually deal with. He nodded at the table for a long time. He got a job offer in February, a good one, in another city. He took it. Before he left, he came down to the kitchen early one morning and found me making coffee, and he stood in the doorway and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm properly sorry. Not sorry it happened. Sorry for what I did and didn't do. That matters. I want you to know that matters enormously. I have heard a lot of insufficient apologies in my life, and I know the real kind when I encounter it. The house is quiet now." For the first week after he left, it was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, the kind that presses on you a little when you sit down at the end of the day. I cried once on a Wednesday evening, standing at the kitchen window watching it snow. Just once. Then I made myself a proper cup of tea and called Harriet, and we talked for an hour and I felt better. It's my house. It's been my house. The blue ceramic bowl with the flowers is back on its proper shelf, and the cabinets are in the arrangement that I prefer, and the main bathroom is mine again in the mornings. I still make cinnamon rolls on Christmas. That particular tradition was never going anywhere. What I want to say to anyone listening, any woman who finds herself nodding along at any part of this story, is that I understand the instinct to keep the peace. I understand wanting to believe that patience is the same as virtue, that accommodation is the same as love. I believed both of those things for longer than I should have. But there is a difference between generosity and erasure. There is a difference between keeping the peace and disappearing. I spent 8 months making myself invisible in my own home, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself it was for my son, telling myself that difficult people eventually become less difficult if you just give them enough room. What I know now is this: some people take all the room you give them and then look around for more. You are not obligated to give it. I am 68 years old. I have good years ahead of me. I plan to use them in a house where I can put a pot in any cabinet I choose. I've thought a lot about what made Claudia believe she could get away with it. Not just the money, though that was the part that had legal consequences, but all of it. The slow takeover of the kitchen, the bathroom, the language she used when she spoke to me. What makes a person decide that someone else's patience is the same as weakness? That someone's kindness has no bottom? I think it comes down to this: when we don't hold our ground early, we teach people where the ground is. I let small things go, one at a time, each one seeming too minor to make a scene over: a cabinet reorganization, a bathroom schedule, the way she said "oh" when she found me already in the kitchen. None of those things felt worth a confrontation, but they added up. They always add up. And by the time she stood in my living room and told me I lived rent-free in my own house, she genuinely believed it. I had helped her believe it by never correcting the smaller versions of that same story. That's not self-blame. I want to be clear about that. What Claudia did, including what the bank investigation confirmed, those were her choices made by her, and she alone is responsible for them. But I have had to be honest with myself about my own part in creating the conditions where she felt untouchable. Accommodation, when it becomes a habit, starts to look like permission. What I found on the other side of all of it was something I hadn't expected: clarity. There's a particular kind of mental fog that comes from living in a situation you know is wrong, but aren't ready to name yet. I had been moving through that fog for 8 months. The morning I sat down at my computer and pulled up those bank statements, something in me had already decided. I wasn't looking for a reason to act. I was finally willing to see what had always been there. Intelligence isn't only about what you know. It's about what you're willing to look at. For a long time, I looked away. From the financial irregularities I hadn't noticed, from my son's careful neutrality, from the direction things were heading. Looking clearly, even when it's uncomfortable, is the beginning of being able to do anything at all. And then there is the matter of what my son did when I finally told him. He could have defended her. He could have minimized it. He could have chosen his marriage over the truth. Instead, he sat at that kitchen table and went pale, and then did the right thing, even though it cost him enormously. I think about that often. Doing the right thing when it's easy is not really character. Doing it when it costs you something, that is. He's rebuilt himself since then. The job, the new city, the phone calls every Sunday without fail. I'm proud of him in a way that's different from before. More honest. Less taken for granted on both sides. What I want to leave you with is this. If you recognize any part of this story, if you're sitting somewhere right now nodding at a detail or a feeling or a particular kind of silence, I'm not going to tell you it will be easy to change. It won't be. But I will tell you that the life on the other side of that change is yours. Actually yours. And you are allowed to want it. I'm 68 years old. I make cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning in a kitchen where I decide where the pots go. That is not a small thing. That is everything.